Hello, and welcome back to episode 2 of Fantasy Grounds RPG map and image creation. I'm Josh, and I am going to be continuing the tutorials on our RPG regional map. In this episode, we're going to be working on the land primarily, and in the following episode after this, we'll be working on the water, and we're going to get those to a pretty basic kind of workable level. As always, it's extremely important to kind of conceptualize things and work slowly up to a more refined map procedure. One of the things that I use very often while I'm working in Photoshop is I use a lot of masked layers. And what that allows me to do, and one of the reasons why in that first tutorial we really were worried about this nice crisp edge, is so that we can use a mask from this layer and constantly build upon that. And one of the great things about that, and you'll see this later on, is it allows us to continually readjust our silhouette, and it has a constant effect on all of the layers that we kind of attach to that mask. It becomes pretty important later on and allows us, when we create these waterways, and just save us a lot of headaches later on. So let's get into this. One of the first things that I like to do once I get to this stage is I put together my color palette. Now, in the beginning, we want to limit our color palette quite drastically. So we will have maybe only 3 or 4 colors that we're going to pick from, and we're going to expand as we move along, but that's kind of where we want to start right now. So you might be wondering how it is that we choose the colors for our images. And that's not always an easy question to answer. What we're going to do, though, is kind of work through that process together, and so you can get kind of an idea of how we come about it. Obviously, one of the things that we kind of want to keep in mind is that contrast that we have going on here. And so we have this very stark black landmass and our white in the background. We want to maintain that, but not to such a high degree as it is right now. And so we can do that through color. And we also have color contrast, and there's such things as complementary colors, but we're not going to get into like a super lot of color theory here. We're just going to kind of get into the meat of it. Now, oftentimes I will set up my color palette in my library, but I'm not going to do that this time. I'm going to do this that's a little bit more friendly for other image editing software and anything in general, even if you were to be doing this on pen and paper, or if you were going to be painting this in watercolors or whatnot. So I'm going to make a new layer right above this white layer, and we're just going to pick some colors and we're going to put them out on here, see their interaction, and then we're going to have a really good judge of how we're going to be doing this. And if we go into our little color selection over here, and I'm just going to pull out it in this window so that we can all have a good idea of how we're going to be doing this. We want our landmass to either be much lighter or much darker than the water. Right now, obviously, it's much darker. So if we get into our browns, we might pick a particular type of color. We might want it to be more yellow or more to the red side, but whatever we pick in here, and we want to keep that in mind. So thinking about that, we can change values later, so it's not overly important, but it's something that we want to keep in our head. And so if we do something kind of middle the road here, if we do it somewhere in the middle, we can still add a lot of shadow and a lot of light, and it's not too far on the saturated side. It's kind of on the more muted tone area. And so that looks pretty good. And we're just going to kind of make a smudge over here. I'm actually going to switch to a hard round brush so that we can get a little bit more information there. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just switch down my opacity down to 25%. And I'm going to pull it out a couple of times. I'm doing it this way. I would normally do it a little bit more fluidly using some of my my nifty tools on my graphic screen, but I'm doing it this way so that you guys can all kind of see different ways that you can do this just using a mouse. Well, we want to get back to 100% now. And from this color, I'm actually just going to slide this up into, and I think we're going to go with a little bit a warmer blue. So a little bit on the green side, and it's kind of in the same area. And I could certainly do that, but I'm going to make it a little bit lighter here. And so I'm going to move it towards the white. And so if I come in here, you can see that it gives us a pretty good example of the contrast that's in there, which is pretty good. Now we're going to be adjusting this as we go. And so this just kind of gives us that innate contrast. And so we're going to hit OK. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to make a little smudge over here. And then I'm going to just drop down my opacity. And I'm going to bring this out a little bit. What we're doing here is we're kind of looking to see how these colors interact, how they mix together. It's not a perfect representation by any means, and we could do this a lot of different ways, but this just gives us a very basic kind of general idea. And we're going to pick one more color right now that we're not going to use right away, but it'll be pretty important later on. And we're going to be picking a green color. So we're going to slide down in here, and we're not going to go that far. We're not going to make a very yellowy kind of green. We're going to kind of go into our more towards the blue. And as you can tell, we're kind of keeping all of these colors very similar in that aesthetic. This time we want our green to be the darkest out of all of the colors. So we're going to move this back down into here. If you want to look at it in conjunction to our actual brown, you could go back and select that color and see how it interacts, but you certainly don't need to. I'm just going to come somewhere in here, get a nice foresty kind of green, and again, we're going to do the same thing. I want to make sure that this is 100 at first. And then I'm just going to drop it down to 25% again. I'm not sure why it's doing that. And bring it in and see how it interacts with these colors a little. Yeah, I think that's all going to work pretty well. And now we have this little palette over here that we can constantly grab from these colors, and we know that it'll be consistent throughout our entire piece here. And that's very important. Now that we have our colors selected, we're just going to start dropping them into our images here, and then we will work on adding some texture to them. We're going to mainly focus on the land, so we're just going to leave a blank kind of color for our water background at the moment. So I'm just going to hit G so that it switches over to my paint bucket tool. If it is not this icon, then it's probably set to the gradient tool, and you just have to hold down your button on the icon. And now I'm going to go right onto my white layer here. We don't need this anymore. And I'm going to just drop that right onto the background here, so that now we have this field of blue. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my landmass, and I'm going to hit Control-Shift-N. What that does is it brings up this new layer window, and I'm going to check this little box that says use previous layer to create clipping mask, and that's what we want. Hit OK, and now what it will do is only populate the pixels dictated by that previous clipping mask, and this is why it's so important to maintain those good edges now that you can see that. We can blend out edges as we need to later on, but this is a great place to start. Looking at this, you can see that we still have quite a lot of contrast. and it's going to be exacerbated as we move along. So this is, again, a good place to start. What we have now, I'm going to just turn this off so that we don't see these colors, and I can turn this on at any time and grab these again. The blue no longer can be seen, but that's okay. We have this whole field to grab that color from if necessary. Now we're going to be working on this landmass. Now, I have lots of different types of textures that I've created over time, and I usually hand draw lots of different seamless textures that I can just implement. But we're going to go through that whole creation process together so that you guys can see kind of how to do it, and if need be, you can make your own. I've put together a couple of different ways to do it simply in Photoshop, and this might work in a lot of other programs as well. And even if there's some things that might change slightly, it does give you a good idea on how you would go about doing it. One of the easiest ways to start this process is to just go outside and take a picture of something that you are going to replicate. And so we're obviously starting with the ground, and so you can just go outside with your phone and take a picture of the ground, or you can grab one off the internet. This is the one that I'm going to be using. It's a very simple kind of image. It has a lot of different types of characteristics. There's some good information in here that we're going to be using, and we're going to be using this in a way that's a little bit different than it's actually portrayed here. We don't really care about the color. We don't really care about any other sort of aspects. Just a lot of those lights and shadows and a little bit of variance in our value as it goes across. One of the things that we want to make sure we do is create this in a way that it is seamless, which means if I were to take this image and repeat it in any direction, it would match up perfectly. And I'm going to show you a really easy way that you can do that. So the first thing that we do to make sure that we create this texture seamlessly is we're going to hit Control Alt I, and that's going to bring up all of these image size dimensions. You can also do it from the drop down image menu. We know that our width is 1200 and our height is 600. So we then go to our filter, other, and offset. Putting in our parameters here, we know that vertically we have 600 to work with here. So we want to go like -300. And that's going to make this right in the middle. Hit OK. You can see that this divide in here isn't exactly what we want to do. And there's a couple of ways that we can go about doing this. So what we'll do is just grab an area in here. It doesn't really matter how wide you happen to do it. Hit Control C and then Control V to paste it. And now when we put this in here, you can see that it doesn't really match up well, and there's a lot of repeating type of situation here. So I'm going to hit Control T again, and I'm going to flip this vertically. We don't want to do it horizontally because it'll mess up a lot of these shadows. We want to maintain that light coming from one direction. And when I go to my eraser now, I have this soft, make sure that I select the soft round brush. I can just kind of go along these edges, make sure that my opacity is back up to 100%, and kind of blend this in. Now this is there's a lot of other ways that work very well to do this. But this is a very, very simple kind of way without a whole lot of hassle. And it's okay if we do it a little bit too much on one side, because what we're actually going to do is we're going to copy this and we're going to hit Control J to quickly make a copy of this. And now we can begin to add a little bit more variance. We're going to change the size of it a little bit here, squash it down. By doing this a couple of times, even though some of it looks a little bit blurred, that's fine because it's going to get lost in some of the stuff that we're going to be doing here. We're going to make this all down to one layer again. We're going to select all of our layers and hit Control E. And we're going to make sure we go back up to our offset again. We want to leave this as it was because it's going to bring us back to where we originally were. And remembering that our width is at 1200, if we do 600, it's going to push us back into this realm so that we can see the seam from the other direction. And we're going to do the same steps again. Just going to grab a selection here. Hit Control C, Control V, and then Control T so that we can kind of manipulate it here a little bit. You can also go in with the clone tool and do all kinds of things to change some of the variance a bit. Now this might mess up a little bit on the edges again, and so we're going to go back and forth a couple of times just to make sure that it all works. Take out some of this just so it doesn't look like it's so repeating. Let some of that other stuff on the bottom show through a little bit. And then we're going to collapse that down. Go back to our filter, other, and it's going to be all set up for us to go back and to check that again. This is still a little bit wonky, so why don't we just make another pass at that. And you can do this back and forth until you get everything pretty much exactly the way that you want it. Each time that you do it, you can be a little bit less particular because you have so many layers underneath here. And here we go. This is starting to look pretty good here. There's a little bit of repeating in through here, and we can just grab our clone tool if we want, and that's going to be right here. Hold down Alt, and you can set where you want the clone to be coming from. I'm going to collapse this down first. And let's make this a little bit bigger, and then we can kind of come in and add a little bit of variance in through here. Just to change it up a little bit. Go back to our offset. Let's put this back to 0 now. And let's put this to 0. Yeah, so now we're back to what we originally had. But now it is going to be seamless. It's going to work wherever we go with it. So to turn this into a texture, the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to remove all of the color information from here. So we're going to hit Control U, and we're just going to bring our saturation all the way down. We're going to copy this layer, and we're going to hit Control I, which is going to make it inverted from what it was before. We're going to change the layer type. We're going to go all the way down to color dodge, and what that's going to do is basically cancel out one to the other. Only the most dark areas are going to show through. Our next step in this adventure is going to be going back to our filters and other, and this time we're going to be going to our minimum. And what this does is it allows us to kind of control this a little bit better on how this is going to interact. And if we zoom in here and I bring this a little bit, this variant here is going to show us how much it's going to allow that bottom image to kind of come through. And because what we're really trying to do is limit the information that's coming. We're just using this for our textures, and we can get this to an area where it looks pretty good as far as what we want to see happen. And usually somewhere about 1 is good. Because now I can come back to that original layer and hit Control L and change some of these parameters so that I get a little bit more of this darker information. I'm using the middle slider and the darkness slider. And as you can see, this has become quite a nice little texture here. So when we collapse this down, we now have this as our nice texture that we can use. We're going to shrink this down. And so I'm going to hit Control T, and I'm going to go up here to these controls, and I'm going to drop this down to 50%. Make sure that I get it in here. And with this button selected, it's going to make it in all different directions at 50%. I'm just going to hit Enter. I'm going to switch to my Move tool. Put this up in one corner, and I'm going to make a copy of it. And how I do this is I just hold down Alt with the Move tool selected, and any image that I drag across, it just makes a copy for me. And now I'm going to collapse these down. I can go back to my Clone tool now. And I can break up this image a little bit more. I can change some of these things so it doesn't look too contrived. We don't really want to do anything on the edges because we want to make sure that this maintains itself as a really nice seamless texture. But we just do want to break up the image here a little bit. There. And now what we're going to do, and this is one of the great neat features that we can kind of do with this, is we're going to go up to our edit and we're going to save this actually as a pattern. We're going to define a pattern here. Just like we defined a brush in our last episode, this time we're going to define a pattern. We can call this tutorial pattern 1, and we're just going to hit OK. And now that we have that seamless texture created, we're going to actually use it on our map here, and all of our work there is going to pay off a lot. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over to where we were just using the clone tool a little bit. We're going to hold down our mouse button, and we're going to select the pattern stamp tool. This will enable us, if it's not defaultly selected, you can pick the one that we just defined here. And what we're going to do is we're going to begin to add it to our map here. We're going to hold Control-Shift-N and make sure we still use that previous clipping layer mask. And we're going to make sure it's a multiply layer. What this is going to do is it's going to add the information to it. We certainly don't want it to be at 100% opacity, but we do want it maybe somewhere around 25, and we can change this later, so you don't have to worry about it too much. And we can also do lots of interesting things with some random brushes and whatnot, but for right now, for the demonstration, well, I'm just going to use this soft round one. And so you can see as I put this in here, and I can kind of click my mouse around, or I can drag it, and we begin to add all of this value information in here. And don't and you want to make sure that you kind of go around. If you don't like areas, you can just click over them. It'll constantly kind of update it as it changes it around. Without this button selected, that'll make it the same all the time. And so this just allows it to kind of be a little more random. And if some of this is a little too much, if it's too much of a value change in certain areas, we can tone it down even a little bit more. And this is just going to be our base. You know, we're going to be constantly building this up. So don't worry too much about getting everything just perfect yet. If things look a little bit too pattern-like, that's okay too. As I said, this is just the beginning. This is where we start. You can see when we zoom in here, we get a lot of nice little texture stuff here. And we can always switch back to our eraser, and we can even come in here and change our opacity of our eraser to like 50% and kind of come in and we can drop down our opacity a little bit more. In fact, why don't we drop our opacity down to maybe 15%, and we can duplicate this layer. It's not going to be inside our parameters yet. We're going to have to do that. But when we do, we can now hit Control T and kind of change the orientation here to give a little bit more variance in there. So we have 2 layers of this going on, and that looks pretty good. And that will be it for this episode. So we've taken it from a complete black and white image, and now we've actually begun to add some of this color information in here. In the next video, we're going to do something similar with the water, so we can have a nice kind of contrast between the two. We can see how that's going to start to interact. And from there, we're going to continue to build this up until we get to our final product. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.